But we probably had the biggest questions about defensive back and secondary, and we've been trying to figure out as much as possible during training camp. I don't know if we've said this, but we do not have a lot of access to training camp. Have we made that clear to people? But secondary has been like our biggest question throughout this entire thing.
Yeah, I don't remember ever mentioning not having training camp access, so it's good to finally get that out there, I would say. But yeah, dude, this is the most questions we have at any position going away. I mean, it's far and away the most questions. We've gotten a couple hints, nuggets here and there. We know some main players. We'll get to those in a minute, but not only is it all new faces, or a lot of new faces. Taz Nicholson returns. Xavier Scott played late last year. You're replacing 3 draft picks in the top 70 and 4 guys in an NFL training camp. So it's big shoes to fill, and there's a lot of shoes that need filled.
Well, there it is. That is the storyline. You are replacing arguably the best secondary in college football. Now, there's maybe ones you could argue were more talented, but 3 in the top 70, nobody else had that, right? So you can make that argument that they were, and they were the most productive, albeit in the Big Ten and in the Big Ten West, where passing is not as crazy as in the SEC or Big 12 or Pac-12. But Devin Witherspoon, number 5 pick in the draft. Quan Martin, the number 47 pick in the draft. Sidney Brown, the number 66 pick in the draft. And Kendall Smith, I mean, what a story he was, really, last year. Is on the Washington Commanders, and he had a nice interception the other night, along with Quan Martin. He's in an NFL training camp trying to make that roster. You got to replace all those guys, Joey. So Taz Nicholson, the only returning starter. So you're not completely starting from scratch. And I think that is the one silver lining here of Taz Nicholson's injury, of some other injuries that happened last year, Tyler Strain, Terrell Jennings. Taz Nicholson was a starter, was a big part of that secondary. When he was out, it was obvious. But Matthew Bailey, I know he's injured. We'll get into him. He's a big question. 180 snaps last year. Xavier Scott, 143 snaps. Tyler Strain, 172. We've seen Strain. We've seen Scott. We've seen Nicholson. So while this is a new look secondary, there is some experience here that was gained in some huge games last year. Now, Xavier Scott and Tyler Strain had some growing pains last year when they were out there, but there's also some good things to take away from those guys.
Yeah, today Brett Bielema said someone like Xavier Scott has played a lot of football, and I thought, he's played some. Definitely helped, though. Football. Yeah, that's right. I think that's the thing, is down the stretch when – look, Taz Nicholson played really good football. That was really overlooked by the 3 top 70 draft picks before he got hurt. He was important, and you saw the secondary suffer when he was hurt. So getting him back is huge, but I know there's a lot of, anger or hand-wringing, I guess, about Devin Witherspoon, Sidney Brown opting out of the bowl game. That got Xavier Scott time. That got Tyler Strain time. Obviously, as you mentioned, the injuries and big moments. I mean, it was a Big Ten West race. Purdue, Michigan State, at Michigan. Like, there were really big moments there that those guys were thrown into, and they're going to be better for it. I just wonder how quickly they'll be better for it, right? I think that's the big question is, you got to, and they addressed it. We'll get into it in the transfer portal. They addressed some more experience via the portal. But, yeah, there are fair question marks, and maybe those go away by October 1st, right? Maybe they come out and it's like, wow, we were really underestimating. I'm kind of joking a little bit, but I was going through our season over-unders a year ago. We drastically underestimated the defense. I don't think we were wrong to do it. But, will that be the case again? I don't think they'll be top like they were last year, but, maybe the secondary won't be a weakness by October 1st, and maybe it's not now. We just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, a year ago now, I think we thought the defense would be pretty good because the last 9 games of the year in 2022 or 21, they were really good. And we thought Ryan Walters was pretty good. They were old. None of us saw Devin Witherspoon as the number 5 pick in the draft. We thought he'd be like a 3rd rounder, right? Something like that. We thought he was pretty good. Quan Martin, while the staff was building him up, it was like, well, yeah, maybe he's going to be an NFL guy. Maybe he'll get into camp. He's a great athlete. Just hadn't seen the production level yet. And Sidney Brown, whom we loved, little undersized, little inconsistent, but last year took his game to another level. And that's credit to Ryan Walters, credit to Aaron Henry, and of course, Brett Bielema as well. They elevated their game to a level that none of us thought they could. And now that's all thrown out the window. Kendall Smith took his game to another level, and now all those guys are gone. We knew that was going to happen, but we would expect, and we'll get into the expectations, that it's not going to be as good as last year. But this still is a defense that has had secondary success, that we've seen Tyler Strain go in last year and play well. We saw Matthew Bailey go in last year and play well. They've recruited this position pretty well. They've added some transfer. So I don't think this group's going to be bad by any means, but the three guys that we can count on, or we think are for sure going to be starters, are all corners / nickel, right? We'll get into the big question of the safeties here in a little bit, but Illinois seems to have a lot of confidence in Taz Nicholson raising his game to another level after a good year last year as a starter. Tyler Strain seems to have solidified the spot as a starter despite adding some JUCOs and Caleb Patterson and Prince Ford and a bunch of freshmen. And then Xavier Scott, if we're marking one guy down as maybe the most breakout performer of the year, especially on defense, the way the coaching staff is talking about Xavier Scott is reminding me of the guy in the same position last year, Quan Martin. They were talking about like, this guy is great. He's one of our best players. They took him to Big Ten Media Days last year, right? I'm like, oh, that's an interesting pick. Feels like Xavier Scott could be that guy next year going to Big Ten Media Days, the way they're talking about him now in that nickel spot.
Yeah, they're not really hiding their excitement about him. I wish I had the exact quote pulled up from Ryan Walters last year, but maybe I'm misremembering it. Hopefully you can. Pretty sure they said they basically recruited him to play nickel. I mean, like that was as it was presented to us, like this is Quan's replacement, this guy. And as we've seen with the secondary, they've kind of said, hey, so, you'll practice here and you'll practice here and you'll practice there. But for them to come out and say, this guy, we see him as a nickel and be as effusive about it as they were, and that's followed up with the summer. Yes, you kind of got to look at that, right? You got to look and say, okay, there's probably something here. I mean, we didn't really get the sense coming into training camp that he wasn't going to be a starter, but Brett Bielema didn't, for as long as he let the quarterback thing go, and as long as he's continuing to let the right side of the offensive line go. That was one of those things where it's like him, that's the guy, starter, and that's it, right? There was no looking back. And I think that matters when you're trying to figure things out, that the head coach and all coaches, right? This isn't just Illinois, but all coaches like to drag out these position battles and, rah, everybody's, it's great. That wasn't the case. It's like, hey, Xavier Scott's going to be a starter. Mm-hmm. Okay, move it along. And I think that means something.
Yeah, and he had some struggles last year, right? I mean, you throw him in there against Michigan, didn't have a great
primarily at that outside corner spot too. Remember, and that's not where he'll play, but that's where he was thrown into.
Right. He's a true freshman, one of the late additions of this class. He's one of the last blue shirts we'll ever have because of the changing rules in the NCAA. 5'10", not the longest guy, but he played really well in that bowl game against Mississippi State. And I thought, that whole secondary, if you want some confidence going to next year, I know Quan Martin and Kendall Smith were playing in that game, but Tyler Strain, Xavier Scott, Matthew Bailey, the caveat that Matthew Bailey's now hurt, all those guys played significant snaps, Joey. And they limited a Mississippi State team that loves to throw the ball to one touchdown, and they had 2 interceptions, right? And 6-7 yards per pass attempt. That was a nice sign for Aaron Henry as a defensive play caller going into that role. And then for a new look secondary, we kind of got a brief look at it, and it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I think if you look around college football, there are position groups at schools, and I'm not saying like the Ohio State wide receivers, but they're in the mix. I don't want to make that comparison, but like edge rushers at Iowa, offensive linemen at Wisconsin, especially when Brett Bielema was there. These schools have position groups where even if they have turnover, you say, well, there's enough body of work here to think they'll be okay. I don't know that I want to say like right now that's Illinois secondary, but this year, if these guys come out and play well, and a lot of them will be returning presumably, I think they've kind of earned that after this year. If they come out and play well enough with a fairly young or at least game inexperienced secondary, Big Ten experienced secondary, you probably got to say, all right, like that belongs in that conversation. The same way we talk about offensive line at Illinois, the same way we talk about running back. Now, it's not on the level of some of those schools I named, but eventually the benefit of the doubt gets built. I think this is a season that Illinois secondary can build that benefit of the doubt.
And what I find interesting about this corner group, and I'm adding Xavier Scott because he plays corner, but he practices a corner, but he plays nickel, is they're recruiting all these really long corners, right? We think of Sabur Kareem, Zachary Tobe, like all these get Toby. Keep messing that up.
You were doing it right for so long.
I was doing it right, and then somebody got in my head.
I like your shirt too.
Oh, the Space Jam. Yeah, Space Jam.
I like to think of you, Duncan, like Michael Jordan. Anyway.
You know me and that explosive athleticism. That's part of me. But yeah, these guys are all under 6 foot. Like they're recruiting all these 6'1" plus DBs, and all these guys are under 6 foot. Taz Nicholson's 5'11". He's listed at 180 pounds. Tyler Strain, 5'9". They don't try to lie there because he is maybe 5'8", but he's gotten big, 190 pounds. And then Xavier Scott's 5'11", 180. But all these guys have that scrappiness. They have that feistiness. The coaching staff likes to say, put their face in the fan. These guys are physical. They play beyond their size, and they're quick. I mean, that's the one thing about being a little smaller is you are really quick. So it's interesting that all these guys kind of have that trait that we saw out of Tony Adams, Nate Hobbs, a little bit of Devin Witherspoon. But we saw Taz have some big hits last year. We saw Tyler Strain willing to put those hits on there. So they still seem to have that identity of what we've kind of figured of Illini cornerbacks the last 3-4 seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. That's feels like that's a Florida defensive back thing. I feel like almost, I think I've told you this, maybe even on here. When these kids commit, or Illinois is in the final, whatever, for whoever, you go and look at their film, and a lot of the defensive backs, you feel like you're watching the tape from before with the way Illinois recruits the length and the way they go. There's not a lot of outliers. Like that is their thing. I don't remember anybody I thought, he probably could be a little more physical. Not with his coaching staff. It is pretty clear as day what they're after.
Feistiness. That's the word I use for this DB group. And Antonio Finellis was one of those guys. He's 5'9", isn't he? Like really undersized when he was at Wisconsin, turned himself into a really good DB there.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was him or Taz or somebody said, Taz was indicating, I kind of talked to him because we're built pretty similarly, and he had a nice career at Wisconsin alongside Aaron Henry. So, yeah, I mean, I know height is a big thing, right? Like measurables are measurables. You can't hide those, but these guys they punch a little bit above their measurables in this Illinois secondary.
I'll wrap up this conversation. It's kind of turning the corners conversation. They sound pretty confident about their corners. Like we'll get into the depth chart here, but of those starters who all have significant experience in big games last year, they seem to have confidence in that group, Joey.
They do. We haven't heard a lot of, and now some of that's training camp and there's nobody to push back on anything because we can't see it. Again, new information here. I keep looking at this group and Taz Nicholson being the oldest. We'll see what ultimately ends up with him after the season. But there's going to be a lot of guys who are going to come back from this group. And a lot of guys behind them. It's freshmen, redshirt freshmen. Like this could be kind of that start of the next wave. And there's a lot of people in that wave, but Illinois needs them, a handful of them to be good this year.
Yeah, the only guy of that group that would probably move on, because I don't see Tyler Strain being that guy, especially at 5'9", would be Taz Nicholson. He's on the Senior Bowl watch list. He's gotten some NFL buzz. If he has a big year, maybe he goes on to the NFL, and that'd be a good thing. You got all these corners, and you got a bunch of talent behind them. That'd be a good thing. But, we got to see it still, but we have seen a little bit. And that's what gives me a little confidence in Strain, Nicholson, and Scott, as we've seen these guys perform in some big games, went through some growing pains, but we've actually seen it. At safety, though, this is the big question. And it becomes a bigger question, Joey, because Matthew Bailey is going to miss at least the first game, at least probably the first 2 games. And I'm still of the mind of like, okay, coming back from a foot injury, the guy was in a boot until last week. Is he going to be 100% Matthew Bailey right away? I don't think it's a plug and play like Matthew Bailey is going to be what they thought Matthew Bailey was going to be if he plays against Penn State. With the hope, I think it's going to take some time. So how does that impact the safety spots? Go ahead, Joey.
Well, we should spend a second talking just about what we know about Matthew Bailey and the foot injury. And Brett Bielema said there was a setback in the summer. We saw him go from scooter to crutches to he'd been in a walking boot through all those times. Most recently, we saw him not in a walking boot. Brett Bielema said he started running. I do want to mention, and I'm with you, like the foot, you just don't know. But Brett Bielema seems to have a lot of confidence that when Matthew Bailey's cleared, it's a pretty seamless, at least mental transition because he's very, very smart about all of this to get him back there. So I do wonder what the ramp up period looks like when that time comes. And we don't know. So I don't want to, make it sound like, hey, Penn State, this guy's back. We don't know, but they do seem to have confidence that the ramp up period mentally won't be that long. There'll be a shorter runway.
Well, yeah, the men's because he's he's a coach in that room already, which is awesome for a sophomore. The way they talk about him is the way they call him Sid 2.0, but it's kind of what they talk about with Sidney Brown. I have no question he'll know what to do when he gets on the field.
Right.
Does he mentally trust his foot? Is his foot 100%? This is a guy who could be special. And Brett Bielema's kind of mentioned this. Like, there's a long-term impact here. So I don't think they should. I don't think they will rush him back if he's not 100%. So I'm just skeptical of him definitely being back for Penn State and him definitely being Matthew Bailey at that point, especially when you're going to have guys with a couple games under their belts. Maybe they're the better option for a couple more weeks if Matthew Bailey's not completely back to being Matthew Bailey. So it's just a question that's going to linger going into the season. And you always seem to have one big injury. You hope this is the one. But Illinois did go into the transfer portal, Joey, heavily at this position. And the Clayton Bush one both perked up our ears because, like, wait, you've already taken Demetrius Hill. You've already gotten Nicario Harper in your program. Now it makes a lot more sense. And those three guys, along with the surprise of training camp, Miles Scott, are going to play a big role. So how do you think this all settles out, Joey?
I think, boy, I can't believe we're saying this because in the spring I wouldn't have said this. At the beginning of training camp I wouldn't have said this. I think Miles Scott is their starting free safety against Toledo. You've been on that for a little bit longer than I have. I think it's pretty clearly trending that way. Brett Bielema said today he's got 30 practices. And in my mind, I thought, it's really not that much. But they've been high on him. They've been high on what he's shown, his athleticism. Aaron Henry said he's just as talented as the two guys before him who had moved around, Kirby Joseph, Kendall Smith. I think that's the lock of the safety room. And then it becomes, how does Clayton Bush, how does Demetrius Hill, how do those reps get split up between those guys? I assume one of those guys is probably going to be in the dime package when they go that route. But those are the three players for two positions. When Matthew Bailey comes back, whatever that is, we'll see what that looks like. I would assume someone gets kicked over to free safety. Probably depends on how they're playing at that moment in time. But those are the three guys. I don't think there's any other names that I'm seriously looking at and saying, oh, I could see them being announced before the Toledo game as a starter.
Yeah, in the spring, I would have thought Nicario Harper was the most likely to, if Matthew Bailey was playing free safety, to be the strong safety. And it just doesn't seem that's the case. We're speculating, but Brett Bielema said a safety is Xavier Scott's backup at nickel. We think Nicario Harper makes sense there. When he committed, I heard he could play that position. So that's why I speculate it could be him. But maybe he's just a two-deep guy for them at that star position. Maybe it's strong safety. But at least you got somebody who's played at this level. So these guys are all unproven for Illinois, especially Miles Scott. But Miles Scott's played football at this level, played some big roles at Michigan, right? Didn't he start that game? Or he played significant snaps at wide receiver at that game. But we haven't seen him play at this position. But if there's one position where your wide receiver skills can help, go and track and get a ball, it's certainly this free safety position. And given what they have done at that position the last 2 years, with two guys who are pretty unknown commodities at that position, Kirby Joseph was a wide receiver at the end of Lovie Smith's last season, right? Or not the end, but the middle of it. And then they moved him back due to COVID and injuries. And then Kendall Smith was in the transfer portal before they brought him back and said, hey, Kirby's gone. You want the free safety spot? And after that first half at Indiana, we're like, is this going to work? And all of a sudden he has 5 interceptions on the season. And Kirby Joseph has 5 interceptions. So you kind of give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, this coaching staff with that position, and they must be really impressed with Miles Scott to put him there.
Yeah, I know. So I'm with you. I think Xavier Scott is going to be like the breakout, but I think a lot of his is going to be like analytics. That PFF is probably going to love him. I think the eye test and be like, dang, they don't, he plays well at the eye test. I think if Miles Scott maintains that free safety spot through whenever Matthew Bailey's return is, I think that could be a guy who passes the number test. And a lot of people are like, who do we have here? Who is this guy? Like, I think he's got, because that position generates a ton of turnovers. Everything
filters there, right? Like everything seems to be funneled into that free safety position where there's so much freedom, at least when they're running so much man. And that's a conversation we'll get into. That he's got the freedom to just kind of read the quarterback's eyes, read where everything's going, read the play, and just go on a deep ball and make the play. And they're pretty good at it. I mean, outside of Kendall getting beat deep against Indiana a few times, those guys were incredibly consistent at making sure nothing got over them and making sure they made a play on the ball. So Miles Scott must be showing some similar things. As for the other position, Demetrius Hill looks the part. I mean, he looks like Matthew Bailey physically. He's 6'2", 200 pounds. Looks like he can come up and make a play. Sounds like he's really intelligent from what the staff says. And obviously he was a freshman All-American at Florida International. But Brett Bielema raves about Clayton Bush as well. So I think both those guys are going to play. It'll be interesting to see who gets to start. I saw one practice where Clayton Bush came in with the first team, so maybe it's him. But I think both those guys are going to get significant playing time. And both those guys have had significant Division I experience. It just hasn't been at the Big Ten level.
Yeah, which is the way it's kind of crazy. This is how it's shaped out, because when they landed Demetrius Hill, that was like a holy smokes, freshman All-American at a position that we thought free safety, which may still end up being the case down the road. We know we can play both. We thought, man, this could be the next, kind of a longer term, not just 1 year stoppers there at free safety. Like, this could be the guy. And then they go and get Clayton Bush, and let's be honest, like, it did not make the waves that Demetrius Hill did. It just didn't. He played at SIU. He started at Western Kentucky. Just didn't generate that interest. I understand it, and the timing was weird. It was after they had taken him. There was a lot of what in the world. And then Brett Bielema stands up there and screams from the rooftops that he loves this kid. He said, if I had him for 2 more years or 2 years, we're talking about a high draft pick. He shows, he's athletic. Like, that all shows up on film. He go up, he's got good ball skills. But he's a guy who I just didn't think when they got that commitment. And again, we didn't know the severity of Matthew Bailey's injury, but I didn't think that this would be the discussion we were having on August 25th.